The morning sun blazed mercilessly over the Arizona territory as Jake Morrison rode his paint horse along the swollen banks of the Verde River. The spring runoff had turned the normally docile waterway into a churning brown monster, carrying debris from the high country, broken branches, chunks of ice, and God knew what else. Jake pulled his weathered hat low over bloodshot eyes, trying to block out both the glare and the pounding in his skull from last night's whiskey. 3 days of unseasonable warmth had melted the mountain snow faster than anyone expected. Now the river roared like a freight train, its muddy waters lapping dangerously close to his small ranch downstream. He should be checking his cattle, making sure they hadn't wandered too close to the flood zone. Instead, he found himself riding aimlessly, seeking any excuse to avoid the empty cabin that still echoed with memories of Sarah's laughter and little Tom's excited chatter. The horse snorted and shied suddenly, ears pricked forward. Jake straightened in the saddle, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt .45 on his hip. Through the cottonwoods ahead, he glimpsed movement near the water's edge. Probably just a deer or elk come down to drink, but in Apache country, a man survived by assuming the worst. He dismounted and crept forward through the willows, parting the green curtain of branches. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. A young Apache girl stood waist-deep in the raging current, her dark hair plastered to her head, desperately trying to reach the far bank. Even as Jake watched, the powerful flow knocked her off her feet. Her head disappeared beneath the brown water. For a heartbeat, Jake hesitated. Apache. The word carried the weight of a dozen brutal raids, burned homesteads, and murdered families. These people were the enemy, savage and merciless. Every rational thought told him to turn away, mount his horse and ride home, let the river take her. But when her head broke the surface again, gasping and struggling, all he saw was a terrified child about to drown. "Damn," he muttered, already shrugging out of his coat and boots. He grabbed his lariat from the saddle and fashioned a loop, playing out the rope as he plunged into the icy water. The current hit him like a sledgehammer, threatening to sweep his legs from under him. The girl had been carried another 20 yards downstream, her strength clearly failing as she fought to keep her head above water. Jake worked his way along the bank, using the overhanging branches for support until he was ahead of her position. "Here!" he shouted. Though he doubted she understood English, he swung the lasso in a wide arc and let it fly. The loop sailed over her head and shoulders just as another surge pushed her under. When she surfaced, coughing and sputtering, the rope was around her chest. Jake dug his heels into the muddy bank and hauled back with all his strength. The girl grabbed the rope with both hands, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Hand over hand, Jake pulled her toward shore, fighting the river's relentless tug. His muscles screamed in protest, and his boots slipped in the mud, but gradually she came closer. When she was within arm's reach, he lunged forward and grabbed her wrist, dragging her up onto the bank where she collapsed, retching river water. Jake knelt beside her, his chest heaving. Up close, he could see she was little more than a child, maybe 16 at most. Her buckskin dress was torn, and angry scratches covered her arms and legs. She was painfully thin, her cheekbones sharp with hunger. As she recovered her breath, the girl's eyes met his. Instead of gratitude, he saw wariness and fear. She scrambled backward like a wounded animal, ready to bolt despite her exhaustion. "Easy," Jake said softly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're safe now." She didn't understand his words, but something in his tone seemed to calm her slightly. Still, she watched him with the alertness of a cornered wildcat, ready to fight or flee at the first sign of danger. Jake studied her face, noting the intelligence in her dark eyes and the proud set of her jaw despite her desperate circumstances. This was no ordinary Apache raid survivor. There was something different about her, a dignity that poverty and fear couldn't diminish. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both freeze. Through the trees, Jake could see dust rising from the direction of town. A search party most likely, or worse, cavalry patrol hunting for hostiles. He looked at the girl, then at his horse, then back at the approaching riders. In that moment, Jacob Morrison made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Come on," he said, extending his hand toward her. "We need to go, now." The Apache girl stared at Jake's outstretched hand, as if it were a rattlesnake coiled to strike. The thunder of approaching hooves grew louder, and Jake could make out at least 4 riders crashing through the underbrush. His jaw tightened. He recognized the harsh voice of Sheriff Dalton bellowing orders to his deputies. "Apache sign near Miller's place. Spread out and check every gully." Jake's decision crystallized in an instant. He scooped up the girl despite her startled resistance, feeling how light she was, nothing but skin and bones. She struggled briefly, then seemed to understand the danger as male voices echoed closer through the trees. "Stay quiet," he whispered urgently, hoping his tone would convey what his words couldn't. He lifted her onto his horse and swung up behind her, feeling her tense against him like a trapped bird. They rode hard through the maze of cottonwoods and willows, staying close to the riverbank where the soft ground would muffle their horses' hoofbeats. Jake knew these bottoms like his own backyard. Every game trail, every hidden wash, every stand of trees, thick enough to hide a man and horse. Behind them, the search party's voices faded as they continued upstream. 20 minutes later, Jake's cabin came into view through the heat shimmer. It sat on a small rise overlooking his modest spread, a few hundred acres of good grazing land hemmed in by red rock mesas. The place looked as run down as Jake felt. Sagging porch, peeling paint, weeds choking the vegetable garden Sarah had once tended with such care. The girl slid down from the horse the moment they stopped, landing with cat-like grace despite her exhaustion. She backed away immediately, her dark eyes scanning for escape routes. Jake dismounted slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Water," he said, pointing to the well pump near the cabin. "Food." He gestured toward the house, then touched his chest. "Jake," he said clearly. "Jake Morrison." She watched him warily, but didn't run. After a long moment, she touched her own chest. "Aiyana," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded and repeated her name, trying to get the pronunciation right. Something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that he bothered to try. He walked slowly to the pump and worked the handle until clear water gushed out. Cupping his hands, he drank, then stepped back and gestured for her to do the same. Aiyana approached like a wild animal coming to water, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. But once she began drinking, she couldn't seem to stop. She drank deeply, then splashed water on her face and arms, washing away the river mud and revealing more clearly the extent of her injuries. Jake winced at the sight of infected scratches on her forearms and a nasty gash on her left shoulder that looked several days old. Her lips were cracked with dehydration, and her buckskin dress hung loose on her thin frame. He went into the cabin and returned with a tin cup and a piece of cornbread left over from his meager breakfast. Aiyana eyed the bread hungrily, but didn't reach for it until Jake set it on the ground between them and stepped back. She ate with careful, measured bites, not wolfing it down as a truly starving person might, but savoring each morsel as if it might be her last. While she ate, Jake found himself really looking at her for the first time. She was beautiful in the way of her people, high cheekbones, large dark eyes, skin the color of burnished copper. But it was her bearing that struck him most. Despite her desperate circumstances, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that reminded him of his late wife. The comparison hit him like a physical blow. Sarah. What would she think of him bringing an Apache girl to their home? His wife had been kind to everyone, regardless of race or station. She'd often chided him for his harsh words about the local tribes. "They're just trying to survive, Jake," she'd said more than once. "Just like us." A distant sound made both of them freeze, the distinctive jingle of cavalry tack carrying on the desert wind. Aiyana's head snapped up, her whole body going rigid with fear. Jake recognized the look. He'd seen it in the eyes of hunted animals. "Inside," he said firmly, pointing to the cabin. When she hesitated, he added, "Safe, you safe." She understood enough to follow him, though she stayed near the door like a cornered coyote ready to run. Jake quickly gathered some supplies, bandages torn from an old shirt, a bottle of whiskey for cleaning wounds, and what little food he had, beans, bacon, and coffee. Through the window he could see dust rising from the main trail. The cavalry patrol was still a mile away, but they were definitely heading in his direction. Jake's throat tightened. If they found Aiyana here, there'd be no explaining it away. Harboring a hostile Indian was a hanging offense in territorial law. He turned to find Aiyana watching him intently, as if trying to read his intentions. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the barriers of language and culture seemed to fall away. She saw his fear, not for himself but for her, and he saw her recognition of the risk he was taking. "Stay hidden," Jake said, pointing to the back room where he and Sarah had once slept. "No matter what happens, stay quiet." Aiyana nodded once, understanding the gravity of the situation, even if she couldn't grasp every word. As she disappeared into the shadows of the cabin, Jake straightened his shoulders and stepped onto the porch to await whatever was coming down the trail. The sound of approaching horses grew steadily louder, and with it the weight of the choice he'd made by the river that morning. Jake forced himself to appear casual as he leaned against his porch rail, rolling a cigarette with steady hands despite the hammering of his heart. The dust cloud had resolved into 6 blue-uniformed cavalry soldiers led by Lieutenant Marcus Hayes, a young officer fresh from West Point who'd been making a name for himself with aggressive patrols against Apache bands. Hayes reined in his horse 20 feet from the cabin, his pale eyes scanning the property with military precision. Behind him, Sergeant O'Malley, a grizzled veteran with 20 years of Indian fighting under his belt, watched Jake with the calculating gaze of a man who'd survived too many ambushes to trust anyone completely. "Morning, Morrison," Hayes called out, touching the brim of his campaign hat. His voice carried the crisp authority of youth and education, but Jake detected the underlying tension. "We're tracking a Apache sign in the area. Raiding party hit the Miller Ranch 3 days ago." Jake struck a match and lit his cigarette, buying time to steady his voice. "Heard about that? Terrible business." He exhaled smoke slowly. "Haven't seen hide nor hair of any Indians around here, though." "Mind if we water our horses?" Hayes asked, though it wasn't really a request. The soldiers were already dismounting, their eyes constantly moving, hands never far from their weapons. "Help yourselves," Jake replied. "Pump's working fine." As the men led their horses to the water trough, Sergeant O'Malley approached the porch. His weathered face was unreadable, but something in his pale blue eyes made Jake's skin crawl. "Mighty muddy boots you got there, Morrison," O'Malley observed casually. "Been down by the river this morning." Jake glanced down at his boots, still caked with mud from the rescue. His throat tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "Checking my cattle. Spring floods got me worried about the herd wandering too close to the water." O'Malley nodded slowly, but his gaze never left Jake's face. "River's running mighty high. Dangerous for man or beast." He paused meaningfully. "Found some interesting tracks down there. Fresh ones." Inside the cabin, a floorboard creaked softly. Jake's blood turned to ice, but O'Malley showed no sign of having heard. The sergeant was focused on something else. A thin strand of wet black hair caught on a splinter of the porch rail, where Jake had helped Aiyana from the horse. "You feeling all right, Morrison?" Lieutenant Hayes had approached, his young face showing genuine concern. "You look a mite peaked." "Just tired," Jake managed. "Haven't been sleeping well lately." That much was true. His nights were haunted by memories of Sarah and Tom, and lately he'd been hitting the bottle harder than usual. But now, with Aiyana hidden in his bedroom, he felt more alert than he had in months. "We heard you've been having a rough time since your family," Hayes trailed off awkwardly. "If you need anything, supplies or such, the fort could—" "I'm managing," Jake cut him off. He'd heard the pity in younger man's voice, and it rankled. The last thing he needed was charity from the army. O'Malley had wandered closer to the cabin, his experienced eyes taking in details most men would miss. He noticed the 2 tin cups by the water pump, though only one showed signs of recent use. He saw the crumbs of cornbread scattered near the well. Far more than one man would drop while eating. "Strange thing," O'Malley said conversationally. "We found where someone crossed the river this morning, or tried to. Looks like they might have gotten swept downstream." His eyes locked onto Jake's. "Lucky thing if someone happened to be there to help." Jake's mouth went dry. "Like you said, it's dangerous water. Anyone fool enough to try crossing would likely drown." "Likely," O'Malley agreed, but his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. From inside the cabin came another soft sound, barely audible, but O'Malley's head turned slightly toward the door. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, then stopped. Drawing on cavalry soldiers would be suicide, and it wouldn't help Aiyana anyway. Lieutenant Hayes checked his pocket watch. "We need to move on, Sergeant. Captain wants us back by noon." He turned to Jake. "You be careful out here, Morrison. These Apache are getting bolder. They killed 3 men at Miller's place, including a woman and her baby." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He thought of Aiyana, barely more than a child herself, starving and alone. What had driven her to such desperate circumstances? What had she seen? What had she lost? "We'll keep our eyes open," O'Malley said, as the soldiers mounted up, but his gaze lingered on Jake's face and on the cabin behind him. "And if you see anything at all, you send word to the fort immediately. Understood?" "Understood," Jake replied. As the patrol rode away, Jake remained on the porch until the dust settled and the sound of hooves faded completely. Only then did he allow himself to breathe normally again. He walked to the cabin door and listened carefully before speaking. "They're gone," he said quietly. "You can come out." Aiyana emerged from the back room like a shadow, her dark eyes wide with residual fear. She had heard everything, he realized. The soldiers' voices, their suspicions, the danger she had brought to this man who had saved her life. She spoke in rapid Apache, her voice low and urgent. Though Jake couldn't understand the words, her meaning was clear. She was grateful, but she knew she had to leave. She was putting him in terrible danger. Jake shook his head firmly. "No," he said. "You stay. You heal first." He pointed to her infected wounds, then to himself. "I help you." Aiyana studied his face for a long moment, searching for deception or hidden motives. What she saw there seemed to surprise her. This bitter, lonely white man was willing to risk his life for an Apache girl he'd known for less than 2 hours. For the first time since he'd pulled her from the river, she truly looked at him, not as an enemy to be feared, but as a man. She saw the pain in his grey eyes, the deep lines grief had carved around his mouth, the careful way he moved, as if he carried some invisible burden. Whatever she saw, it seemed to decide her. She nodded once and sank into the cabin's only chair, exhaustion finally overwhelming her adrenaline, but her eyes never left the door, and Jake knew she would bolt at the first sign of real danger. He also knew that Sergeant O'Malley wasn't finished with his suspicions. The old soldier would be back, and next time he might not be so easily fooled. The afternoon sun slanted through the cabin's dusty windows as Jake gathered his makeshift medical supplies. Aiyana sat rigid in the wooden chair, watching his every movement with the wariness of a wild creature. The infected gash on her shoulder had begun to fester, and angry red lines spread from several of the deeper scratches on her arms. If left untreated, blood poisoning would likely kill her within days. Jake approached slowly, holding up the bottle of whiskey and clean rags. "Medicine," he said, pointing to her wounds. "Hurt first, then better." Aiyana's eyes flicked to the bottle, then back to his face. She understood enough. She'd seen white men's medicine before, usually administered at gunpoint in army camps, but something in Jake's gentle tone and careful movements told her this was different. She nodded once, a quick jerk of her chin, and turned slightly to give him access to her injured shoulder. Jake moved behind her, and she tensed at having him where she couldn't see him. Her whole body was coiled like a spring, ready to fight or flee. "Easy," Jake murmured, the same tone he'd use with a spooked horse. He soaked a rag with whiskey and paused. "This is going to hurt." The first touch of alcohol to infected flesh made Aiyana gasp and arch away from him. Jake caught her shoulder gently, steadying her. "I know," he said quietly. "I know it hurts." As he worked, cleaning each wound with careful precision, Jake found himself studying her more closely. The scars on her back told a story of hardship, some from thorns and rough travel, others clearly from violence. A puckered mark on her left shoulder blade looked like an old bullet wound, poorly healed. This girl had seen more than her share of suffering. "What happened to you?" he asked softly, knowing she couldn't understand but needing to voice the question anyway. "Where's your family?" Aiyana spoke in Apache, her voice barely above a whisper. Though Jake couldn't understand the words, he heard the pain in them, loss, fear, and a terrible loneliness that resonated with his own. When she finished, tears tracked silently down her cheeks. Jake's hand stilled on her shoulder. Without thinking, he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small worn photograph, Sarah and Tom, taken just months before the cholera took them. He held it where Aiyana could see it. "My wife," he said, his voice thick. "My son." He touched Sarah's image. Sarah, then Tom's. Tom, both dead, sick, gone. Aiyana studied the photograph, seeing the love in the woman's eyes, the joy in the small boy's face. She looked at Jake, understanding flooding her features. This man knew loss as intimately as she did. The walls between them, white and Apache, settler and native, seemed less important in the face of shared grief. She touched her own chest and spoke a single word in Apache, then struggled to find the English. "Family, gone. Soldiers." She made a gesture with her hands, a sweeping motion that spoke of scattering, of destruction. Jake's throat tightened. The Miller Ranch raid. Had it been retaliation for some cavalry action against her band? The cycle of violence that plagued the territory suddenly seemed more real, more personal than the abstract concept of Indian troubles he'd always thought it to be. He resumed cleaning her wounds, but now there was a different quality to his touch, less clinical, more caring. Aiyana seemed to sense the change. Her muscles relaxed slightly, though she remained alert. As Jake worked, he began to talk, not to her exactly, but to fill the silence. He spoke of Sarah, of how she'd tended his own injuries when he'd been gored by a bull 3 years ago, how she'd sat by his bedside for days, forcing him to drink bitter herbal teas and changing his bandages with infinite patience. She was good with hurt things, he said, wrapping a clean cloth around Aiyana's shoulder. Birds with broken wings, stray dogs, even a rattlesnake bite on our neighbor's boy. She had gentle hands. Aiyana listened to the cadence of his voice, understanding more from his tone than his words. This man had loved deeply and lost deeply. Like her, he was carrying wounds that went far deeper than anything visible on the surface. When Jake finished with her shoulder, he moved to the scratches on her arms. Some were minor, but others needed attention. As he worked, Aiyana began to relax further. His touch was competent but careful, and she sensed no threat in his proximity. "Water," she said suddenly, the English word clear despite her accent. She pointed to her lips, then made a drinking motion. Jake nodded and fetched the tin cup, filling it from a ceramic pitcher. As she drank, he noticed her hands, long-fingered and graceful, but calloused from hard work. The fingernails were broken and dirty from her desperate journey, but he could see they'd once been well cared for. "You're not just any Apache girl," he said thoughtfully. "Someone raised you well, taught you things." Aiyana lowered the cup and looked at him. After a moment, she spoke in halting English. "Father, teacher, white man's words." She touched her chest. "Learn many things." Before, her voice trailed off, and the pain returned to her eyes. Jake understood. Her father had been progressive, probably one of the Apache leaders who'd tried to work with the government to find a peaceful path forward. Such men often ended up dead, caught between the hostility of whites who saw all Indians as enemies and the suspicion of their own people who viewed cooperation as betrayal. The sun was setting, painting the cabin walls with golden light. Jake realized he'd been doctoring Aiyana for over an hour, and she'd allowed it, even begun to trust him. The transformation was remarkable. The terrified, feral creature he'd pulled from the river was still there, but glimpses of the intelligent, dignified young woman beneath were beginning to emerge. "Hungry?" he asked, pointing to his stomach. Aiyana nodded, and Jake set about preparing a simple meal, beans, bacon, and coffee. As he cooked, she watched him with curious eyes, noting how he moved around the cabin with practiced ease, how he seasoned the food with careful attention to flavor. "Are you cook good?" she said when he handed her a plate. "Wife teach you?" Jake smiled, the first genuine smile he'd worn in months. "Yes, Sarah taught me, said a man should know how to take care of himself." As they ate in comfortable silence, Jake realized something had shifted between them. The language barrier remained, the cultural divide was still there, but underneath it all, they'd found something more fundamental, a shared humanity that transcended race and circumstance. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Jake knew that tomorrow would bring new dangers, new challenges. Sergeant O'Malley would likely return, and Aiyana was still weak from her ordeal. But for now, in the flickering light of the oil lamp, two wounded souls had found an unexpected sanctuary in each other's company. 3 days passed in uneasy peace. Jake watched Aiyana's wounds begin to heal, her strength slowly returning with proper food and rest. But he also watched the horizon constantly, knowing that Sergeant O'Malley's suspicions would eventually drive him back to the ranch. The old soldier was like a hound on a scent. He wouldn't let go until he found what he was looking for. On the 4th morning, Jake woke to find Aiyana sitting by the window, her keen eyes scanning the desert landscape. She'd heard them before he had, the distant sound of approaching horses. But this time, it wasn't cavalry. Through the pre-dawn gloom, Jake could make out a group of Apache warriors moving carefully through the scrub brush toward his cabin. "Your people?" he asked quietly. Aiyana nodded, her face a mixture of relief and apprehension. She spoke rapidly in Apache, pointing toward the riders, then at Jake. Her meaning was clear. They'd come looking for her, but they wouldn't understand why a white man had helped her. Jake checked his rifle, then set it deliberately aside. If he was going to die this morning, it wouldn't be in a futile shootout that would accomplish nothing but more bloodshed. He'd made his choice days ago when he pulled her from the river. The Apache warriors approached with the fluid grace of men born to the desert. There were 5 of them, faces painted for war, rifles ready but not yet aimed. Their leader was a man of perhaps 40 years, his weathered features bearing the marks of countless battles and hard-won wisdom. Aiyana stepped onto the porch, speaking quickly in her native tongue. Jake caught the sound of his name, Morrison, repeated several times. The leader's dark eyes fixed on Jake with penetrating intensity, as if trying to read his soul. The conversation continued for several minutes, voices rising and falling in the rhythmic cadence of Apache. Jake stood motionless, acutely aware that his life hung on words he couldn't understand. Finally, Aiyana turned to him. "My uncle," she said, indicating the leader. "He asks, why you help me? Why risk for Apache girl?" Jake looked into the older man's eyes that had seen too much death, too much betrayal from white men who spoke of peace while planning war. How could he explain that it hadn't been a conscious choice? That when he saw her drowning, all he'd seen was another human being in desperate need? "Tell him," Jake said slowly, "that I lost my family. I know what it feels like to be alone, to hurt. When I saw her in the river, I couldn't let another person die when I had the power to help." Aiyana translated, her voice carrying the weight of Jake's sincerity. Her uncle listened, then asked another question. Aiyana hesitated before translating. "He asks if you expect payment, what you want in return." Jake shook his head. "Nothing. I want nothing." This seemed to surprise the Apache leader more than anything else Jake could have said. White men always wanted something. Land, gold, safe passage, information. The concept of helping without expectation of reward was foreign to his experience with Jake's people. Another rapid exchange in Apache. Then Aiyana spoke again. "He says, you are different from other white eyes, but soldiers come soon. You cannot keep me safe. I must go with my people." Jake nodded, understanding the logic even as his heart sank. In the few days she'd been here, Aiyana had become more than just someone he'd rescued. Her quiet presence had filled the terrible silence of his grief, giving him something to focus on besides his own pain. Without her, the cabin would return to being a tomb of memories. But as if reading his thoughts, Aiyana continued, "Uncle asks, you come with us? To our camp? You are friend now. We protect you too." The offer stunned Jake. To leave everything behind, his ranch, his memories of Sarah and Tom, his entire way of life, and join an Apache band as a refugee from his own people? It was impossible, wasn't it? Before he could answer, the sound of approaching cavalry cut through the morning air. Sergeant O'Malley had returned, and this time he'd brought more men. Through the growing light, Jake could see at least a dozen soldiers cresting the hill that overlooked his property. The Apache warriors tensed, hands moving to their weapons. Their leader barked sharp orders, and they began to scatter toward defensive positions among the rocks and scrub. In moments, Jake's ranch would become a battlefield. "No!" Jake stepped forward, raising his hands. He looked at Aiyana's uncle, then at the approaching soldiers. "There's another way." He walked deliberately into the open ground between the cabin and the rocks where the Apache had taken cover. When Sergeant O'Malley and his patrol came into view, Jake was standing alone in his dooryard, hands clearly visible and empty. "Morning, Morrison," O'Malley called out, but his eyes were scanning the landscape with the wariness of a man who sensed danger. "Thought we might find some interesting company here." "Just me," Jake replied steadily. "Same as always." O'Malley dismounted, his hand resting on his sidearm. "Funny thing. Got word from a Mexican trader that he saw Apache sign leading this direction. Fresh sign." His pale eyes locked onto Jake's. "You sure you haven't seen anything unusual?" Jake met his gaze without flinching. "I've seen a lot of unusual things in my life, Sergeant. Most of them involved men doing terrible things to each other for reasons that made sense to nobody but themselves." "That's mighty philosophical for a man who's supposed to be simple rancher," O'Malley said. "So you've been drinking this morning, Morrison?" "Not yet," Jake replied, though the day's still young. For a moment the two men stared at each other, the grizzled soldier who'd seen too much war and the grieving rancher who'd found something worth protecting. Behind O'Malley, the other soldiers sat their horses nervously, sensing tension they couldn't identify. Then, from the rocks, came a sound that changed everything, the cry of a red-tailed hawk, clear and piercing in the desert air. But Jake knew it wasn't a hawk. It was a signal. O'Malley heard it too, his head snapping toward the sound. "What was that?" "Hawk," Jake said simply. "Lots of them around here. They nest in the high rocks." But O'Malley wasn't convinced. He gestured to his men, who began to spread out, weapons ready. The morning that had started with the possibility of peaceful resolution was sliding rapidly toward violence. That's when Aiyana made her choice. She stepped out from behind the cabin, hands raised, her chin lifted with quiet dignity. "I'm here," she said in clear English. "The one you seek." O'Malley's hand flew to his gun, but Jake stepped between them. "Don't," he said quietly. "She's not armed. She's not a threat." "She's Apache," O'Malley snarled. That makes her a threat by definition. She's a scared girl whose family was killed, Jake said firmly. Just like mine was killed. Just like yours might be someday if this war doesn't end. For a heartbeat, something flickered in O'Malley's eyes, a recognition of shared loss, shared pain. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the hard certainty of a man who'd chosen his side long ago. Step away, Morrison. You're harboring a hostile. That's a hanging offense. Jake didn't move. Behind him, he could feel Aiyana's presence, steady and calm despite the danger. Around them, hidden in the rocks, her people waited. One word from him, one sudden movement, and the desert would explode in gunfire. "Sergeant," Jake said quietly, "what if I told you that helping her has been the first decent thing I've done since my family died? What if I told you that for the first time in 3 years, I don't want to crawl into a bottle and never come out?" O'Malley's weathered face showed confusion, then something that might have been understanding. "Morrison. She saved me," Jake continued, "from myself, from becoming something Sarah would have been ashamed of. Sometimes mercy isn't weakness, Sergeant. Sometimes it's the only thing that makes us human." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of choices that would define who they were and who they might become. In that moment, on a dusty ranch in the Arizona Territory, the fate of 4 people, and perhaps much more, hung in the balance of one old soldier's decision about what kind of man he wanted to be.